hear you, and it's up and running. And actually, I kind of like that because I want you guys to have fun with this, and I'll take some photos of you folks, and so that will add something to it. But I think the main thing is tell me what the project is exactly that you've got here.
So the Sing and Dance with Frank Sinatra One Step started back in 2019 when Chuck reached out and we were talking about collaborating on a project. At that time, we weren't really ready to move forward, and we just kind of started shaping the idea of what do we really want that's unique and interesting about Frank Sinatra. And for Impex, as I shared with you before, we're a boutique label. Our releases are curated. It's not just a single sample, a reissue, but we always like to add something that's value, something interesting, something historic. So the anniversary of this album was in 2020. 2020 was the 70th anniversary. So we decided to do the standard 33 and then do a deluxe one step, which is going to be available in June of this year. And how the standard, the one step came in the picture was we had so much interesting information from stories, from photos, that we decided it was worth the one step treatment. And this album was also it was important because it came at a pivotal moment in both Frank's career and also in the music career. In 1950, Frank was kind of falling out of favor with his fans, with the label. Columbia was thinking about dropping him, and he was having a lot of problems in his life. And Frank was known for more of a romantic ballad. So his producer, I think it was Mitch Miller, wanted to kind of resurrect his career by doing a release that's more jazzy, more snappy, and this is the beginning of Sing and Dance with Frank Sinatra. Also, at the same time, magnetic tape was coming into the picture, so that noisy 78 shellac was kind of falling out, and the new magnetic tape was coming in this industry with higher fidelity. So this was the first Frank album done on 10-inch, 33 full album.
As far as 33 is concerned, this was 1950.
This was 1950.
Okay. Like, when was the first 10-inch put out ever?
Columbia, they had been working on it, but the first 10-inch LPs came out in June of 1948.
Okay, so this is very recent technology, and
yes.
The recording to tape was
even newer, because in 48, Columbia was still recording on 16-inch transcription discs.
Okay.
And then even when they started, even for this album, when they started to record on magnetic tape in 1950, Columbia hadn't committed to tape yet. Like, it's not that they didn't commit to it, but they weren't certain that this was going to work.
Right.
So at the same time as they recorded mag tape of the session at 30th Street, they fed the sound up to 799 7th Avenue, where they had 2 or 3 16-inch transcription lacquer cutters. And so for a lot of sessions in 1950 to 51, we have tape and disc source for the sessions, which is very interesting. And then by mid-51, they had tapered off and stopped using the discs, and they were fully using tape.
And the lifetime of the 10-inch was very brief in the grand scheme of 33 RPM, right?
Yeah.
It was from 48 to...
around 55.
Okay. And how many 10 inches had Sinatra done prior to this time?
Well, so, all right, let's go back to 1946.
Okay.
The way that records were consumed were as 78s, right? Singles were 178 with 2 songs.
Yeah.
But what they started to do in the mid-40s was create album sets. So Bing Crosby, who was singing in these Paramount films,
Yep.
they would come out with a 478 disc set in an album. And the reason they called them albums was because they looked like photo albums when you open it up. And you had 478s or 8 songs. Frank Sinatra was one of the very first to recognize the potential of creating an album that was thematic. And when I say thematic, it wasn't like they took 8 different songs from 5 years of his recording career that happened to be ballads. He said, I want to go into the studio and record 8 songs with a unified feel and a unified theme and present it as a concept album. And this was kind of unheard of. So they were doing compilation albums. Bing Crosby sings Hawaiian songs, but it may have spanned 1932 to 1947. With this album, The Voice of Frank Sinatra, Frank went into the studio and recorded 8 songs specifically for this 78 album set. Fast forward 2 years, Columbia has now successfully created the 10-inch LP technology. The first 10-inch LP was a classical record. The first pop 10-inch LP was The Voice of Frank Sinatra.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, George Avakian, who was the producer in charge of creating the new 10-inch LP line at Columbia, said, oh my gosh, The Voice of Frank Sinatra, which was a 78 album set, is the perfect 10-inch LP. It's 8 songs, it's pop, it's Frank, it was intended to be a concept record, and that became Columbia CL 6001.
Okay.
And that was The Voice of Frank Sinatra. So that was in 1948. Between 48 and 52, they did maybe about 7 or 8 Sinatra 10-inch LPs.
Okay.
All but 2 of them were just compilation albums.
Yeah, right. I assumed that was the norm.
Yeah. So they did a set called Dedicated to You. And it was 8 songs from Columbia, but it spanned 4 or 5 years. It wasn't 1 session or 2 sessions. And what was interesting is that they put that record, that concept out. It wasn't a concept, it was just an idea. You know what I mean.
I sure
So
do. Yeah.
I've Got a Crush on You was a 10-inch LP, Dedicated to You, Get Happy, Christmas Songs by Sinatra. But what they did is they put those out as a 10-inch LP and as a 78 album, 78 shellac album set. They put out an EP box set, and they put out individual gatefold EPs. So they covered every format, 45, 78, and 33. 1950, Frank had started to really slide. He was having a lot of personal problems. He was losing his film deal. His television deal with CBS was over. And Columbia Records said, hey, your sales are dismal. So we're going to drop you from the label. And Mitch Miller said, hey, Frank, why don't we do an album of up-tempo songs? Because you do up-tempo songs so well, and we really haven't focused on that. So they got George Saravo, and they went into the studio and they recorded 7 songs. They had an 8th song from a session the year before in 1949. And when they went into the studio, Frank had recently had a vocal hemorrhage.
Can this pick it up? Are we okay?
It will pick it up.
Yeah.
I know from experience.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or
So-
sit closer, maybe.
Because I have experience with using it, and it does. And
Okay, I was gonna say, sit closer that way.
And you don't need to hear me as we know what I'm asking, and you'll hear me too.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I know I've wondered before, but
Yeah, 'cause I'm
I've
hearing
been here with a lot of talk when there's people all around. And I'm talking to Josh Mazar,
Oh,
and
good.
I pick up every word. So I just it's running, right?
Yeah.
It's still going.
I
Yep.
believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
And we're golden. I guarantee
Good.
you we'll hear
So
it.
Frank goes into the studio
Yeah.
to
we're good.
record, but his voice is hoarse. So Mitch Miller says, we have the ability to overdub now, because we have recording tape. It's not disc recording. We can overdub with tape. So let's not get any vocals. Let's just record the band. And then in a couple months, when your voice is better, you come back in and we'll do your vocals. And that's exactly what they did. April of 1950, they laid down the instrumental tracks. Frank came back between June and September, we think. And they played the tape back in the studio. He had headphones on. He overdubbed the vocals to another tape, and that became the master. So we went back. I had remastered these songs through the years at Sony, but we used the disc masters, which sound great. We just cleaned them up digitally, and that was that. When it came time to do this record, because Abe really is known for analog, I said, let me see what we have on the original tape. Not knowing whether that tape was going to be over-processed, but I called in the 10-inch LP tape, which was actually all the choice takes. They snipped off the session reel and put on the 10-inch LP reel, and that was the first generation tape, and that's what we used. And it was 70 years old, and we put it up in the studio, and it really sounded phenomenal. We were very lucky.
That's wonderful.
No degradation of the oxide, and the fidelity was there, and we we're very careful about aligning the heads and having everything, all the azimuth is aligned and all the bias is tweaked, and we fooled around with all that stuff, and we adjusted everything, and we got the best transfer we could, and we transferred it to a 30 IPS analog tape, and that became our master tape.
It makes Sinatra fans very happy.
Well, it's really a matter of being true and authentic to the integrity that was afforded this project in 1950. So we could have done any number of things. We could have changed the sonic profile. With AI today, we could have made a stereo recording out of the mono. I would never want to do that, and neither would AB, of course, because that's really not what this is about. This is about taking a great analog source and just reproducing it for this generation, and at the same time preserving it. So in my vault search, I found some of the pre-vocal instrumental tapes with just the band. So we used a few of those as bonus tracks. I found alternate takes of the vocals where you can hear him do the vocal, and then he stops, and they rewind the tape, and he does it again and again. We included one of those.
At work.
Yeah, exactly. So we included one of those as a bonus track. So I wanted to bring people into the process, and in writing the liner notes, because I had written a book about how Frank Sinatra made his recordings, called Sessions with Sinatra. I had interviewed the songwriters, musicians, arrangers, recording engineers. I did research on the studios and the microphones. So I was able to take all of that historic information and those archival interviews, in which all of the people had died since my book was written. And I was able to create an essay that puts you in the studio and gives you a sense of the time and what was happening around the making of this record, both in Frank's life and in the recording world, and how the sessions came together, what some of the stumbling blocks were. Mitch Miller, for example, told me that overdubbing was not allowed. The Musicians Union was absolutely against overdubbing in 1950. So they had a strict rule. They said there will be no overdubbing, and if you're caught overdubbing, we're going to levy a very significant fine against you. So he said, I knew I had to overdub. So he said, I went back. He said, and I had.
Tell him to turn it down.
He said I had Frank come into the studio, and we locked the doors. He said because the Musicians Union reps would sometimes make unannounced visits just to check on things. He said if they found us overdubbing, we would have been screwed. It was Columbia Records. That would have been a big deal. So he said we came in late at night, and behind locked doors, we went ahead and overdubbed this record. Which I thought was pretty cool.
I want to ask about Sinatra. His very first 78 that Sinatra ever recorded. Not. It probably wasn't Sinatra, but it was with a big band. What year would that have been?
Well,
Ish.
the first record that we know Frank Sinatra made was in
They're demoing with their customers.
Okay. On back there.
That's good.
We'll be fine.
it was in 1939.
1939. And I guess my
and
point.
it was not a commercial record. He joined a local musician from Bayonne who knew that he liked to sing. And the musician had a little jazz combo, and he was going into Harry Smith Recording in New York, which is a pretty big independent recording studio. And he was making a record, and he said to Frank, "Do you want to come along?" So Frank goes along, no expectation of anything. And the band records their 3 sides, and there was 10 minutes left over at the session. So Frank Maine, M-A-N-E, who was the band leader, turned to Sinatra and said, "Do you want to sing something?" And Frank said, "I'll sing Our Love." So with the Frank Maine Orchestra, Frank Sinatra recorded his first record, Our Love, which is based on Tchaikovsky. And they made 2 copies. Frank got one, and the other Frank got one, and it's out there. It was sold at auction about 10 years ago for a lot of money.
Cheap. We're going to go back another table.
All right.
And I'm going to ask you a couple